around them. Another thing that we see is that they can decrease soil stabilization. So when we see a virus like white pine rust come in, it can kill an entire stand of white pine trees. And in essence, without those trees there, they'll eventually collapse, and then that changes the soil stability. And so we can see these huge ecosystem changes when invasive species come in and disturb the biodiversity. We also see that invasive species can disrupt food chains, and this happens across a variety of species. The picture in the bottom right is called Hemimysis anomala. It's a red mysis shrimp that's found in the Great Lakes region, and these guys have a voracious appetite. They swarm in clusters that you can see about 500 of them per cubic meter, so that's a very high density of them, and they will eat lots and lots of small algae and zooplankton. And when their populations get so high and they're eating so much food, they are taking food away from the other invertebrates and essentially small fish, and then you see a cascading effect up the food chain. So we see that invasive species, when they come into an area, can change the entire food chains of ecosystems. We also see that invasive species are extremely good competitors for natural resources. In this case, the picture you see is called kudzu vine. This is an invasive species in Florida mostly, and it's creeping up into Alabama and Georgia as well. But these vines can cover, what you're seeing here was a forested area where the vines are covering even the canopies of the tree. And so what they're doing is they want to grab as much sunlight as possible. And while doing so, they're essentially creating a blanket over all the other plants and taking all the sunlight away from them. So they're competing for sunlight as a resource. There's other plants that compete for water, for the food resources that are available, for nutrients in the soil, but invasive species are very good competitors, which makes them a threat to the native species and global biodiversity. So here are a few pictures for you to see. These are Asian carp. They are located in the Mississippi River drainage basin, and you can see I have a video later on that will demonstrate how dense their populations can get. These are an invasive snail called the New Zealand mud snail. They are located out west in the Colorado River basin. And these guys, this is just one small rock that was pulled out of a river system. Their populations can get very, very high, and they'll disrupt the food chain for other invertebrates. This is an algae. It's called didymo. This is in the Great Lakes basin. And you can see how thick and dense the algae can get. When it does this, it'll block out sunlight for other submerged aquatic vegetation. It also takes up a lot of nutrient resources. And then this is purple loosestrife. It is mainly a wetland plant. And again, you can see it forms these very thick, dense monocultures. And while this is a beautiful plant, very aesthetically pleasing, nice to look at, we see that when it forms these huge, dense monocultures like this, the diversity decreases drastically. Habitat for animals and insects and birds decreases. And so while it may be pretty to look at, it has a huge effect on the ecosystem as a whole. And then these are European starlings that are flocking. These outcompete a lot of our native bird species. So this just gives you an idea of some of the different species that we see as invasive. Okay. Now, invasive species can have huge impacts to the biodiversity, but they also have economic impacts for us. In some cases, when there's aquatic organisms like algae and dry-scented mussels, these will clog the intake valves at power and water treatment plants and cause them to shut down or cause damage to the valves. So we see that in some cases there is a large amount of local, state, and federal revenue loss associated with these invasive species. So not just direct impacts to power plants, but also we see that the money aimed at eradicating them has a huge economic toll. Timber sales is another economic problem. So there's an invasive species called the emerald ash borer that parasitizes native ash trees, which are they used to be pretty ubiquitous throughout the U.S. But since the ash borer has been introduced, you can see in this picture, they can kill massive stands of ash trees. And this has a big effect on the timber sales ash trees are actually were the predominant wood used for creating baseball bats. And so we see huge issues economically associated with timber sales, also within fishing. So this not only affects the Great Lakes, but a lot of the river systems and drainage basins across the U.S. Invasive species that come in can outcompete for resources. They change the food chains. They can have huge effects on the sports fishing populations. What this picture is showing, this is actually a paddlefish located within the upper Mississippi River drainage. And these have sea lamprey that are attached to them. And sea lamprey are a parasite. They are an invasive species that came up through the St. Lawrence Seaway, and they attach to other fish. They're kind of like this little Dracula fish. They will attach and essentially suck the blood and resources out of bigger fish, which quite often can lead to their demise. We also see that invasive species have an economic impact on the tourism to certain areas. Now, this is not only related to fishing and the park systems, but also to a lot of beaches that people go to visit. This is an algae that is being washed up onto some of the sandy beaches. This was normally a resort beach that people would flock to for vacation spots. But when the algae gets washed up on shore after a large algal bloom, this also happens when massive invasive fish species die off, and also when there are zebra mussels that die off and accumulate on the shoreline. These make these areas not used or not accessible for recreational use, and then they see a huge economic impact to the tourism because people don't want to come to the beaches when they are crowded with algae or decaying fish or zebra mussels. Okay? So not only do we see economic impacts and impacts to global diversity from invasive species, but we also see a lot of human health impacts. The bottom left corner is called the tree of heaven. It's an ailanthus species. And in control areas where they're trying to eradicate this, the sap is actually poisonous, and it can cause myocarditis or inflammation of the heart valves. So we can see human health effects. The West Nile virus, which is carried by mosquitoes, and oftentimes an invasive mosquito species, like you see in the picture in the lower right corner, causes respiratory infections in humans. And then cholera, or the species called Vibrio cholera, is transported in a lot of ballast waters, and in tropical areas it gets emptied into a lot of the water supplies through the ballast water, and it kills thousands of people. And there was one epidemic in South America that killed a lot of people all at once. So we can see that there are human health impacts that are also associated with invasive species introductions. Okay, now for these species to be introduced to an area and survive and thrive, they have to overcome this obstacle course. So I'm going to outline what the invasive species obstacle course is, and then I'm going to give you a case. So the invasive species obstacle course is there are geographic barriers that an invasive species has to overcome. There are survival barriers, establishment barriers, dispersal and spread barriers, and after they've overcome all of these barriers, they then need to cause a negative environmental, ecological, or human health effects. Okay? So the geographic barriers are typically oceans, or mountains, rivers, or deserts. And so what we see around the Great Lakes Basin is what used to be a geographic barrier was Niagara Falls, which you can see down in the bottom left picture. And so in order to get ships through from the ocean to the Great Lakes, they developed a canal system. It's called the St. Lawrence Seaway, and it's canal was used to bypass Niagara Falls so that ships could get from the St. Lawrence River to Lake Ontario. And so this was a geographic barrier that kept a lot of invasive species out, but once that canal system was opened, then ability to be able to swim through that canal and enter the Great Lakes system. So there's first geographic barriers that they have to overcome, and oftentimes this is helped out by human facilitation. Okay, so here's this case study I'm going to give you. I'm going to talk about dreissenid mussels, and these are zebra and quagga mussels that are located in the Great Lakes Basin. So there's two species of them. The zebra mussels are called Dreissena polymorpha, and the quagga mussels are called Dreissena rostriformis bugensis. And these are native to Eurasia, or the Ponto-Caspian area, which you can see in that bottom map. And they had to overcome the geographic barrier of the Atlantic Ocean in order to be introduced to the Great Lakes. And so they did this by hitching a ride in ballast waters. So these zebra mussels, or dreissenid mussels, were introduced into the Great Lakes in the mid-1980s by being released through the ballast waters of ships. Now, ballast waters are what you can see exiting the ship in the picture on the right. For a boat to sit firmly as it's traveling through the ocean. Without ballast, the ship would sit higher up in the water column and be very prone to tilting or collapsing. So what they do is when they're at a port, they've loaded on their freight, they'll take on a ballast water in order to stabilize the ship. And then as they go from port to port, loading and unloading their freight, they will take on or release more ballast water. And so ballast can be 25 to 35% of the entire vessel weight. And then sometimes there's more than 150,000 tons of ballast water or sediment on board a boat at any one given time. And we've seen that this has been a huge problem within the Great Lakes because more than half of the invasive species that we see in the Great Lakes have hitched a ride through the ballast water, including the zebra mussels. So to overcome the geographic barrier of the Atlantic Ocean, the zebra mussels had to take a ride on the ballast water. And Lindsay asked, is ballast water more likely to introduce species than attachment to vessels? Yes, actually, and it depends on the case. So when you're thinking about a transoceanic freight, so that's going from Europe to the U.S., oftentimes in Europe they are freshwater ports, and then they're traveling through the saltwater ocean, and then they're coming into freshwater ports inside the Great Lakes region. So oftentimes anything that would be attached to the vessels as they're traversing the ocean would not be able to survive the ocean, the salt water. So oftentimes the transoceanic freights, yes, it's more likely to be introduced through the ballast waters. But when you're thinking of localized shipping, so either ballast or ships that are going from port to port in the Great Lakes or up and down the river systems of the Mississippi, we see that it's both. It's actually attachment to the ships that can transport them from port to port or region to region, or the ballast water. So it depends on the water body that we're talking about. I hope that helped. Okay, so the next obstacle that invasive species have to endure is a survival barrier. And these are the environmental factors that they need in order to live. And these can be any environmental factors. I've given you a couple examples here. So it could be moisture levels, it could be the soil, the type of pH in either the water or the soil, the amount of nutrients that are available. So sometimes it's really high nutrients, sometimes it's really low, and we're talking about usually nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium. There's temperature regimes that they are specific for them to survive, and then there's the amount of competition. So when we're thinking about zebra mussels, and you don't need to really know what these numbers are, I'm just giving you an idea of what their habitat requirements are. So the adults need a specific pH as well as the larvae in order to develop. They have to have calcium in the water to build their shells. The water needs to reach a temperature higher than 53.6 degrees Fahrenheit for reproduction to be successful. They need a minimum amount of oxygen in the water at all times because they do not handle anoxia or a lack of oxygen very well. And they need little wave action because too much aerial exposure can kill them. Okay? And in the Great Lakes, all of these All of these characteristics are available to them. So they have to overcome a survival barrier, and then they have to overcome establishment barriers. And these are the species, once it's introduced, and it can survive what the biotic factors are in that environment, then it has to be able to form self-sustaining populations. So it must be able to survive and thrive in an area. And that includes being able to find mates, being able to reproduce, and then each life stage has to be able to survive in that region. So that includes the eggs and the larvae and the juveniles. And I've given you a couple pictures below of the water lettuce is an invasive aquatic plant. And these are the different life stages kind of all in one picture. So there's the small plants and the adults. And then in the right picture, it's sea lamprey. And these are the juvenile sea lamprey. So they have to be able to overcome these establishment barriers. Now, I'll give you a little bit of the life history and how the zebra mussels got established. So zebra mussels are called an epifaunal creature, which means that they attach to objects. And in that top right picture, you can see those little hairs that are coming out of the bottom of it. Those are called byssal threads. And they are a proteinaceous appendage of the mussel, and it allows them, they're very sticky, and they can attach to surfaces. Now this is the bottom of the boat, this can be rocks, this can be other animals. Like you see in that middle picture, those are zebra mussels attached to a crayfish. Okay. And then, so their offspring, once they've reproduced, they have this free-swimming offspring, and adults can produce 40,000 offspring each season. And that's a high number of offspring. So they're free floating for a little bit, and then they settle out into the water column. And then they have pretty rapid colonization. Once they settle out, we can see densities up to 200,000 per square meter. So they have really high densities. So they've overcome, let me go back. So they've overcome their obstacles for getting to an area and adapting to the abiotic factors, and then they survive and thrive really easily. Okay? And then comes the obstacle of being able to disperse and spread to new areas. So they need to be able to leave their site of establishment, and typically for an invasive species, what we see is that this will occur at a high rate of speed. So a couple ways that dispersal can happen. In the bottom left picture is a cedar waxwing. Now that's a native bird, but it's eating a berry from a hedge called privet. And when birds eat the berries, they'll fly off and later digest and release the seeds into new areas. So that's one way that species can be dispersed. Another way is through just basic water flow. So in the right picture, this is water hyacinth that is covering the surface and oftentimes dispersal is human-mediated, so through recreational boating or shipping, transport, but it also occurs naturally through birds and animals eating seeds and through water flow. So for zebra mussels, I'm going to show you what their dispersal and their rate of dispersal looked like. So they were first located in the Great Lakes around 1988, and they were found first in Lake Erie and then later that year in Lake St. Clair. So by 1989, which is just 1 year later, we've seen that they're located throughout a huge portion of Lake Erie, but then also they've entered into Lake Michigan. And then in 1990, now this is 2 years later, in only 2 years, zebra mussels dispersed to all 5 of the Great Lakes. So they've been in Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, Lake Huron, Michigan, and all the way up to Lake Superior. Being released. A lot of the dots that you're seeing are the harbors, the shipping harbors and ports. So they are being released through the ballast water. But this is just 2 years later. 3 years later, they've entered into the Mississippi drainage basin and in the Mississippi River. And then by 1992, 4 years later, they're becoming more widespread, especially throughout New York and the river systems in New York. 5 years later, they've reached the Gulf of Mexico. Okay, this is a very tiny species, so it's traveled pretty quickly in just 5 years. And then 15 years later, you can see by 2003, they're incredibly widespread throughout the Great Lakes. And then this is a picture that a map that was produced by the U.S. Geological Survey, and the dots are showing the difference between the zebra mussels, the quagga mussels, and where both of them are occurring. So the red dots, you can see the pretty widespread ones are the zebra mussels. The quagga mussels are the green dots, so they've also occurred throughout the Great Lakes. And then both species are the blue dots. Now, if you'll kind of divert your attention over to the Nevada, California area, you can see some stars. That's where they found zebra mussels being trailered on boats. But then you see those green dots. Those are the quagga mussels that had invaded Lake Mead and different lakes out west. So within 15 years of being introduced to the Great Lakes region, they were actually transported across the continent and introduced into lakes out in Utah, California, and Nevada. So they had a pretty good dispersal rate. So the last obstacle for an invasive species to truly become an invasive species is that they have to cause negative environmental, ecological, or human health effects. And these effects have to outweigh the benefits that we receive from them. So, case in point, honeybees. Honeybees are actually a non-native species. They were introduced from Europe for pollinating crops and garden plants. And typically we don't think of these as an invasive species because we get a benefit from them. So the top picture you see there is a picture of a supermarket produce area. And the top picture shows what a produce area typically looks like, and that the majority of the produce we get comes from pollination by bees. Now, if you look down at that bottom picture, they've removed all the fruits. So if we didn't have bees, native bees or the European honeybees, to pollinate our crops, you would see that we'd have significantly fewer choices when it comes to produce. So we have a huge benefit from honeybees, which are a non-native species. So we don't typically think of them as invasive. Now, contrary to that, we have the red fire ant. And these guys can sting people just like honeybees can. And these came from South Africa. But we don't really have a beneficial effect from them. What we actually see is they are very aggressive. They kill a lot of native insects, and they can attack pets and humans if you encounter their hives, and they have a very painful sting to them. So when we're thinking about these two species and the negative environmental, ecological, and human health effects, European honeybees are not native, but we don't really consider them invasive because we get a lot of benefits from them. On the contrary, red fire ants are not native, but they produce a lot of damage to the native invertebrate communities and to human health. So we think of them as an invasive species. So that's the last obstacle that organism has to overcome to become or considered as invasive. So when we think about zebra mussels, they've had huge impacts to our ecosystems and to the economics of the Great Lakes region. So zebra mussels can displace a native amphipod called Diapraia. And these are a very important aspect of lake fish diets. And without these, we've actually seen a lot of the fish populations plummet. So zebra mussels have caused a cascading effect in the food chain. We also see that they can transfer Clostridium botulinum through the food chain. So let me explain this real quick. Clostridium botulinum is a naturally occurring bacteria in a lot of waterways. And it produces a toxin called botulism. And most of you have probably heard of botulism in food poisoning. And it comes from this bacteria. And so what we see happening, botulism mainly affects vertebrates, so humans and animals and fish. Zebra mussels are considered an invertebrate. They do not have a backbone, and they don't have a neurological system like humans do. So they are immune to the effects of botulism. So zebra mussels are a filter feeder, and they can accumulate this Clostridium botulinum, the bacteria, into their systems as they're filtering. And if they release the exotoxin, if they release botulism, it does not affect the zebra mussels. But if we have a fish come along and eat the zebra mussel has botulism inside of it, and it passes botulism to the fish. And then the fish is affected by the botulism, and it will start swimming erratically because it's a neurotoxin, and the fish will get usually picked up by a bird because it's an easy target, it's not behaving naturally. The bird then ingests the fish that ingested the zebra mussel that accumulated botulism. So now the bird has botulism. And then the bird is affected by the neurotoxin, doesn't behave normally, and will either drown or pass away on the shoreline, which it will then potentially be eaten by a coyote or a dog. And so we see that the Clostridium and the botulism are being passed up the food chain where that naturally would not normally occur at the rate that it's been occurring. So we see these effects with botulism. We also see issues with microcystis blooms. And anybody living near Northwest Ohio knows that there was an algae bloom just a few weeks ago. Bloom. And so what happens is that zebra mussels, being a filter feeder like I mentioned before, will filter particulates out of the water column and deposit them at the bottom of a system. That's called benthification. And so when they do this, they're clearing the water column, and by clearing the water column, they're allowing more sunlight to penetrate into the water, which will allow for more algae to bloom. And so we actually see an association between zebra mussels and these toxic algae blooms. Okay? We also see that zebra mussels affect our native or our natural ecosystems by extirpating or killing off our native clam populations. So native clams, they're called uniatids. In this top right picture, you can see a clam that is completely covered by zebra mussels. So zebra mussels, remember I said, were epifaunal. They will live attached to hard substrates. So they'll attach to these native clams with zebra mussel densities. And what we've seen since their introduction in the late 80s is that zebra mussels have really accelerated the extinction rates of native clams by at least 10 times their normal rate. So in a 10-year span, they approximated that there were nearly 640 million native clams killed in the Hudson River system just because of zebra mussels. So they're having huge ecological impacts. But we also see that zebra mussels have a huge economic impact. Nationwide, there's about $1 billion spent each year for control measures and to repair damages caused by zebra mussels. When they clog the intake valves, they stop production at power plants. And in a 10-year span, the Ontario Power Generation lost about $30 million because of shutdown at the company and trying to clear away their water valves. In Monroe, Michigan, the city water treatment plant lost water for 3 days, and in the early 90s, they spent about $787,000 just trying to find ways of keeping zebra mussels from clogging their intake valves. So there's this huge economic impact by them. Okay, so we've talked about the obstacle course, what species need to overcome in order to become invasives, and I kind of walked you through the case study for zebra mussels. But we want to know, what role do humans play in spreading invasive species? How do they get here, and why are invasive species such a problem now? And what we see is there's a lot of ways that they are being introduced. One of them is through aquaculture or the pet trade. So purchasing pets or catching and releasing pets from different areas. Aquaculture is referred to as like keeping aquariums in your house. So Burmese pythons are a snake that is very popular in the pet industry. And these are being released at high rates in the Florida Everglades. So people will get these snakes when they're small, and they can get quite large. They can become 10 to 12 feet long in just a few years, like you can see in this picture. So people will purchase these pets, and then when they get too big, they just kind of release them. And their species populations have boomed in the Florida Everglades, and they eat a lot of bird eggs and native reptiles and amphibians, so they'll eat turtles and they'll eat lizards, and in a lot of cases they'll eat crocodiles. They'll also eat small pets. So because of being released from people who no longer wanted these pets, their populations have become out of control. Goldfish are an invasive species that most people don't normally consider. So you get a fish maybe at a fair during one of those coin toss games. You take it home, and then they can kind of get big after a few years. And so oftentimes people will release them into ponds or river systems because they don't want to keep them anymore, but they don't know what to do with them. And goldfish actually do really well out in the wild, and they can get quite big, and they can outcompete native fish species. So we see a problem with these guys being released. There's a plant called hydrilla that is used very frequently in aquariums, in planted aquariums. And oftentimes when people are done with their aquariums, they'll just kind of either flush plants down the toilet, which they think is safe, but those actually get caught in water treatment plants and usually will go through the grates and end up into waterways. Or they'll release them into a nearby ditch or another water source or a pond, and their populations can get out of control. Oriental weatherfish are another aquarium fish that we see released and can survive, especially in the Great Lakes region. So the aquarium trade and the pet trade industries are huge sources for a lot of invasive species introductions. Okay? But we also see recreation plays a big role in this as well. So recreational boating, and this was a question that Lindsay had asked earlier about invasive species being attached to vessels versus ballast water. And this is another really important way. So zebra mussels attach to the hulls or the bottoms of ships. We see plants that get caught in the propeller or the prop, or they get attached to the boat trailer, and then a fisherman will go, or a recreational boater will go from one lake to another lake and carry invasive species to new areas. We also see bait bucket release, so fishermen who will purchase crayfish or collect crayfish or small minnows from one water body or purchase them from a store will release them at the end of the day into whatever water body that they're fishing in. And in the Great Lakes region, there's a crayfish. It's called the rusty crayfish, and it is actually native to southern Ohio. But it was introduced actually into the Great Lakes. It didn't naturally occur there. There's a divide in the watersheds between North and South Ohio. So there's a geographic barrier, the watershed divide, that the species could not naturally cross over. But people were collecting them and selling them at bait shops, and they were being purchased and then released into areas around the Great Lakes, and they've become an established invasive species. We also see through recreation the transport of invasive species in firewood. So I talked a little bit earlier about the emerald ash borer decimating ash tree populations and affecting the timber industry. And a lot of their transport came through the firewood industry. So people would purchase firewood to go camping with and to build bonfires and for cooking, and they would transport it to all these different campsites and recreational facilities and take this emerald ash borer with them. So we see that recreation plays a role in transporting invasive species. Gardening or ornamental horticulture does as well. So these are 4 species of plant, and there's many of them that have been introduced this way. Purple loosestrife, that was a picture I showed earlier where there's a huge big monoculture, and that was introduced through actually apiaries or people who were beekeeping and gardens. Yellow floating heart, which is that top picture that you see there, was introduced through aqua gardens. Burning bush is actually a very common shrub used in a lot of landscaping. And then flowering rush was again used for like rain gardens and aquaculture or water gardens. And these were all plants that have been very good at becoming invasive into natural areas. So gardening is one way. We also see what I talked a little bit about earlier was that the shipping industry, whether it's across oceans or across the continent, plays a big role. So we talked about ballast water, so this intaking water or sediments in order to provide stability and trim while crossing the ocean or crossing large lakes, and then dumping that water when you get to a new port that can pick up invasive species and then drop them off at new areas. But we also see shipping pallets. So this was actually how the emerald ash borer was first introduced to North America. It came in on shipping pallets excuse me, that had the larvae burrowed into them, and they came into Detroit, and then they were spread throughout the Great Lakes region by recreational users. So they were initially introduced through shipping pallets, and then they can't fly very well, so they don't spread well on their own, but by people carrying them through firewood, they were able to spread to other parts. Ecosystem engineering is another way that humans have played a big role in contributing to the spread of invasive species. So by doing this, we are essentially removing barriers. So I talked about earlier, Niagara Falls was a huge barrier from the St. Lawrence Seaway to the Great Lakes system, specifically Lake Ontario. And when they opened the St. Lawrence Seaway, in order for freighter ships to be able to carry cargo from other parts of the U.S. into the Great Lakes, or specifically from other parts of the world, so these transoceanic ships wanted to come in and bring their goods to the Midwest. And so they built this very extensive canal system that would bypass a lot of the islands and the changes in the rivers like waterfalls. So they want to be able to bypass that. So in the bottom left picture, what you can see is that this is the canal system on the left. The river is actually on the right. So this very long canal system is a series of locks and dams that will allow ships to bypass elevation changes and a series of islands in the river. So these ecosystem engineerings and the removal of a barrier, specifically being able to bypass Niagara Falls, allowed for invasive species. And in this case, this is where the sea lamprey was able to swim through that canal system and enter the Great Lakes. And then something else we see is an issue with stocking. And this was a video that I had. I'm going to try to screen share it with you so you can see it. But oftentimes what we see is that there is stocking for either recreational purposes. So there's a fish called a tench, which you can see on that left picture. And this was actually brought into a lot of lake and pond systems for recreational fishing. And then its population kind of got out of control and it spread to new areas. Grass carp was another fish. It was stocked into southern catfish farms in order to reduce the amount of algae and vegetation that was growing in those ponds. And then during flooding events, grass carp were released. So I'm going to share a video with you real quick, and hopefully I can get it to start. But I want to show you there's Asian carp were fish that were, sorry. Asian carp were fish that were introduced. They were stocked into southern catfish ponds. So I'm hoping you guys can all see this. Okay. Okay, I want to show you that again. So Asian carp were introduced into catfish ponds, and they, through a flooding event, were able to escape and enter into the Mississippi River and the Illinois River systems. And their populations have boomed. They've gotten out of control. And so this is a team of researchers. They're electrofishing on the Illinois or in the Mississippi River. And look at the sheer number of Asian carp that are jumping out of the water. There are thousands of them. So this is a species that was purposefully stocked and then escaped and became very successfully invasive. Hopefully you were all able to see that. Okay. And hopefully it went back to the PowerPoint. Can somebody let me know if that actually went back to the PowerPoint or not? It did. Good. Thank you, Lindsay. Okay, so stocking of fish, and oftentimes there's other species that are brought in to control an invasive species. So there was a case with the emerald ash borer. They were debating on introducing a wasp called an ichneumon wasp from Asia in order to try to control invasive emerald ash borer. And what they were worried about is by introducing or stocking that wasp, it would then become an invasive species itself. So grass carp, that top right picture, there was an invasive plant called hydrilla that was getting into these catfish ponds. So they brought grass carp over to control the invasive hydrilla, and then the grass carp themselves became invasive. So another way that humans have contributed. And then there was something called the American Acclimation Society. And this was a group that was founded in New York City in 1871. And their main goal was to bring over as many European species as possible. And they did this, they had in their mind that this was for the best economic gain and for cultural reasons. They wanted to bring these beautiful species over. And the president of the society in the late 1890s was a Shakespeare enthusiast. And so his goal was to bring over every species of bird that was ever mentioned in Shakespeare's plays. And they introduced hundreds of different birds and lots of species into the Central Park area. And then from there, their populations became invasive and they boomed. And so two of the species that were introduced through the American Acclimation Society were the European starlings and the house sparrow. And the starlings, which you can see in the bottom left picture, look at how that is a flock of starlings, and look at how dense their populations can get. And house sparrows are the same way. And these cause a negative environmental impact because they can outcompete a lot of native birds. And what they typically do is that they will take over native bird nests. So if bluebirds are building a nest and lay eggs, house sparrows will actually go into the nest box, kick their eggs out, and use the nest that they built to lay their own eggs. They have a really detrimental effect on a lot of the native species. So this is another way that we've played a huge role in introducing them, was through this American Acclimation Society, which has, for good reason, is no longer an active group. So we've kind of talked about what invasive species are and why they're bad and what impacts they have, and give you a couple ideas of it. So the next question is, what can we do? So I've introduced this topic, and I've given you some information and some things to consider, but now you might be wondering, okay, what do we do with all of these invasive species? How can we help? And what can we do to prevent further infestations? So one of the most important things that we need to focus on is the detection of invasive species. So if you were to look at this graph, you can see that the bottom axis, or the one that runs horizontal, that is time. Okay, so through time. And then if you look at the y-axis, or the one that runs straight up and down, that's the area infested and the amount that it costs to control it. So if you're looking at this graph, through time, the longer we wait, the more area becomes infested and the higher the cost it is to control it. Okay, so you look into that green area, the bottom part of that graph, and the detection is the most important thing that we can do, because by detecting it early, the prevention and eradication of an invasive species is easier. So early detection makes it easier to stop them from spreading or becoming established in an area. As time goes on, that becomes a much more complicated system. So by the time people are aware that we have a problem with this invasive species is when it's usually too late to be able to do anything. Okay, so public education is crucial, making sure that people are aware not only of how that they contribute to it, but what they can do. But how do you really stop the spread besides public education? Physical removal does not seem feasible. It depends on the system that you're working in, and it depends on the species that you're working in. So let's say it is a plant species that's being introduced into a port. If it's just one port, or even if it's a fish or an invertebrate, if it's just one port that it's been introduced into, and the detection is early, and we know it, they can actually cordon off an entire port, and they've done this in some areas where they will cut off an entire bay, and they will either use dredge nets or they'll use chemicals to kill off the species. So in some cases, it really is feasible. So being able to detect it, know that, or know where the potential for it to occur. So not just detection, but be able to preemptively identify, okay, this is a hot spot where they're likely to be seen. That's where you can control, or that's where you can kind of section off your control efforts. And then public education. So they may not be aware that their boat is transporting species. They may not be aware that their aquarium pet can become an invasive species. They may not be aware that the beautiful flower they just purchased for their garden can have its seeds dispersed and take over to an area. So education is a really important factor as well. Another thing that's quite interesting and actually very fun is there's special initiatives that people are doing to try to control them. One of them is called Eat the Invaders. So there's a group of restaurants that are getting together to serve entrees that are based on invasive species. So humans as a group are very good at eradicating species, passenger pigeons and buffalo and wolves, and we're very good at eliminating them. So what they're trying to do is use human effort in order to these are lionfish, and lionfish are actually an invasive species in a lot of the coastal areas. They have toxic fin rays that can harm people. They're also very aggressive fish, and they can outcompete a lot of the native tropical reef fish species. And so there's these special initiatives. They can help kind of rehabilitate some of the economic impacts. So not only are we trying to eradicate a species, but at the same time we're trying to boost the economy by selling them. Okay? And then one of the other things is to just simply be aware of how your actions can contribute to it. So informing people, you know, don't release your goldfish. Don't flush your aquarium plants down the drain. Be aware of what garden species become really invasive and be able to tell people about it. This is actually, the garden species is something that's close to my heart because before I was aware of what plant species were invasive, my mom and I had planted several species, including privet hedges, that we had no idea that they were invasive. And it wasn't that we wanted to contribute to it, we just didn't know. So the public education and being aware and trying to get initiatives like garden centers posting posters of what invasive plants look like and potentially not even selling them at all. These are all ways that we can help try to slow down the effects of invasive species. Okay, so there's a couple really good websites that if you're interested in learning more about this, you can go to them. Theinvasives.org, the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, has a task force on invasive species. And then in the Great Lakes region, there's the Great Lakes Information Network, or GLIN, that also has a lot of really good information on invasive species. So hopefully I didn't breeze through that too fast, and I hope that you liked it, and I would be happy to answer any and all questions that you might have for me. And thank you for listening and attending. And hopefully, Lindsay, I was able to answer your question on how do we stop the spread besides public education if physical removal doesn't seem feasible. Okay. So what is my job title right now? Currently, I'm a graduate student. I'm working on my doctorate. After I received my master's, I worked at the Institute for Great Lakes Research in Mount Pleasant, Michigan, and I was a lab technician and lab manager. And so I'll tell you the favorite parts of my job there, and then I'll tell you the favorite parts about what I'm doing right now as a graduate student. So as a technician, we were doing a lot of coastal wetland monitoring. And so for me, it was absolutely amazing. I traveled all over Michigan, almost the entire coastline, doing surveys. So the travel part was great, but I think my favorite part was educating people. Being able to meet people, they were interested to see what on earth we were doing out there, and oftentimes people were very tentative and they just wanted to know, and you could actually see them get physically engaged into the work we were doing. So that was my favorite part of that job, was the outreach aspect of it. But it was also great being able to travel throughout Michigan and see so much of the Great Lakes. And some really cool ecosystems along the way, just really unique and cool ecosystems. So what I'm doing right now, I'm a graduate student at the University of Toledo. I'm working on my doctorate degree. I'm in my second year, and I am working on habitat suitability modeling to determine there's an endangered species called the lake sturgeon. It's endangered in Ohio, threatened in Michigan, and it is no longer occurring in the Maumee River. That's the main river system that runs through northwest Ohio. And so what I've been commissioned to do is build a habitat suitability model to determine what is the ecosystem in the river like? Can it sustain sturgeon populations if we were to reintroduce them? And so, again, I think my favorite part is the field work, being able to be out on the boats and see the river in a way that I had never really seen it before. But it's also really exciting to be a part of a project that I will never in my lifetime see the end result. So lake sturgeon, if we were to reintroduce them, they can live for 100 years. They can take 25 to 30 years before they start breeding again. And so it's really cool for me to be part of a project that is trying to rehabilitate an endangered species, and at the same time knowing that the species I won't be able to see the end result. It's kind of interesting. A little disappointing because I want to know that it works, but at the same time, it's pretty cool. Yeah, and I'm sure it would be the same with whales too. Yep, because they live so long. I do have a Twitter. That is, I have a Twitter and I have email, obviously, that you can email questions to me too. That's actually how, and yes, I will give you both of them. That's actually how Deb found me to do this webinar today, was from following my Twitter feed. So I will post both of them on here, and then anyone can feel free to follow me on Twitter, or ask me questions on Twitter, or ask me questions through email. So my handle, I think that's my handle. I'll have to look at it. I know it's aqua. Actually, I'm going to have to look it up because I can't quite remember. Oh, you know what? I spelled it wrong. There we go. That second one is my correct. And then I have a very long email address. There. So my Twitter, the second one, the Amare with A-M-A-R-E. That's the Latin for water loving. And then my email addresses. Are there any other questions that I'd be able to answer for any one of the classrooms? Well, thank you very much. This was a really great opportunity. This was my first webinar. Hopefully it was good for you guys, and you were able to follow me. I'm sure I talk kind of fast, but thank you for inviting me to participate. I appreciate it. I agree, Lindsay. I love to collaborate. So yeah, get a hold of me, and if I can help out in any way or get involved. I've never worked with whales before, but if I can get involved or collaborate in any way, I'd love to. Yes, and thanks to Deb's classroom for organizing the webinar. You guys did a really good job with it. Lindsay, where are you from? Massachusetts, okay. Cape Cod. Very cool. All right, well that probably ends our webinar. I think there was another one that was just getting started at 11 a.m. and students were probably shuffling over to that. So if you want to get a hold of me, please feel free to use Twitter or use either one of the email addresses I provided. And thanks again, Deb, and to your class for putting this together. This was a lot of fun. And I don't know if they can pull the PowerPoint from the webinar. If not, let me know and I'd be happy to email it to you.